a great crowd tonight. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Patricia Blick. I'm the Executive Director of the Quapaw Quarter Association. And for those of you that have come to our programs before, you'll notice on the food and beverage table that we have champagne. So we're raising our glass to celebrate our full year of preservation conversations as we're ending tonight. So thank you all very much for your support of this. So it has been, Shelley and I were talking about it, it's been a really great year with the participation of the speakers and the attendees and the support that we've gotten. We're going to do it again next year. How about that? Yeah. I would like to recognize some of the support that we received. Again, I'm Patricia Blick. I don't know if I pointed out Shelley Stormo. She is our membership and activities coordinator. So she keeps us very well organized. And for this 2019 year, we had the support from the Arkansas Humanities Council with a grant for the programs. We had a grant from the Quapaw Nation. And we also had an anonymous gift in honor of Carl Miller to support the program this year. And also, I'd like to recognize Cromwell. They are the ones who provide the space for us to use, very heavily subsidized. So thank you very much, Cromwell. Dan Fowler is here from Cromwell. He's their CFO. So give him a big thanks because we're going to do it here again next year. And we appreciate that. I know sometimes it was hard for people to find us initially, but I think everybody now knows where we are. So very, very great space. We do have our corporate supporters and our landmark members on a panel right by the front door, so take a look at that as you're entering and exiting. And of course, thank you to all of our QQA members who help us put this on too. And we always say, if you're not a member of the QQA, we invite you to join. You can do it with as little as $35 a year. That's our membership rate. So we invite you to join us, and at the end of John's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the reasons you're going to want to join us, because we're going to have our members-only reception in January, and I'm sure you're not going to want to miss that. Can everyone hear me very well? Okay, good. I am so pleased. Who said that? Was that Wally? Jim? I thought it was Wally's sweater that was causing the sound problem. Sorry. I'm a little bit jealous, as you can tell. I keep talking about it. I am so pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. John A. Kirk is the George W. Donaghey Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. His research focuses primarily on the history of the Civil Rights Movement. He has published 8 books, and his 9th, an edited and annotated collection of primary documents titled The Civil Rights Movement, a Documentary Reader, published by Wiley and Blackwell, will be published in early 2020. Kirk has also published in a wide variety of journals, edited book collections, newspapers, and magazines, and he has held a number of grants and fellowships in both Europe and the United States, including at the Roosevelt Study Center, Middelburg, the Netherlands, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, Boston, and the Rockefeller Archive Center in New York. I think John will talk a little bit about this, but everyone has a copy of the Civil Rights Trail pamphlet, but that'll tie in with his talk. But I just want us to give him a warm welcome. Thank you. Dr. Kirk.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Patricia, and to the Quapaw Quarter Association for inviting me along tonight. How's that? Better? Okay, very good. I've given this talk a number of times over a number of years now to different constituencies, and it's one of the enduring bits of research that I think people remain interested in and love to interact with. And the talk has changed over time as well. It's kind of interesting how it's kind of picked up and morphed and changed and been added to over time. And that's always helped by feedback. And, I'm looking forward at these events and tonight to Q&A session, because a lot of people here and all the different places I speak have been impacted a lot of times by the things I talk about. I talk about the kind of grand scheme of change in the urban landscape in Little Rock over the course of the 20th century. But many people, of course, here and elsewhere have lived through that. And it's always fascinating to see how people link their own individual and family histories and plug it into the kind of broader changes that I talk about. I think one of the things that's intriguing about this talk and this approach to race relations and civil rights is that it often is kind of at odds with how we often think about the civil rights movement and the narrative of the civil rights movement as it's popularly conceived. You know, as it's been popularly appropriated, I think the civil rights movement has become part of American national folklore, and it's generally seen as a kind of march to progress narrative, right? We moved from terrible times of segregation, but marched forward and overcame that and moved forward, and it shows that America's a great democracy and it overcame those problems and moved on to a brighter future. That's kind of often the sort of arc that it follows. But this talk follows a very different kind of arc that's more unfamiliar, I think, in terms of civil rights, and it suggests that over the course of the 20th century, what happened in Little Rock is one of increasing and entrenched segregation. That segregation gets more entrenched rather than desegregation. So it talks about the deeper entrenchment of segregation and the decay of one very distinctive, specific set of race relations and race relations regime called Jim Crow, which began in the 1890s and has become the kind of recognizable face of segregation in the United States. You know, the water fountain pictures that we all see with the white and colored labels above them, the kind of, you know, hallmarks of Jim Crow. That has, in some ways, I think, through the civil rights narrative as it's conceived, has become the kind of quintessential sort of racial discrimination. Those signs, lynchings, racial violence, those things are kind of classed as what racial discrimination looks like. And in some ways, because they don't exist anymore, it's an easy way to say, well, those things don't exist anymore, therefore racial discrimination doesn't exist anymore, therefore we put those things in the past. What I'm talking about over the course of the 20th century here is one regime of segregation replacing another one. That is what I chart as the decline and decay of the old Jim Crow system, but at the same time that is dying and decaying, the emergence of a different form of segregation that looks different, that is more embedded into the geographical landscape of the city, but that effectively ends up doing the same kinds of things that Jim Crow segregation set out to do. So what I'm talking about is a shift in race relations from one segregated regime to another segregated regime, arguably a regime that is even more deeply entrenched and more difficult to address than the earlier one was. And if you'd expected a kind of more uplifting talk for Christmas, I'm sorry. I have to apologize at the beginning because it's not. So let me go through these slides. All right. Okay. There we go. Got it. Thanks. Right. So let me jump in here, and I'm going to return to this map at the end of the talk. But what it shows, I think, is a segregated city as it exists today. And the maps at the top there, courtesy of Dr. Jess Porter, who's the department chair of the history department, even though he's a geographer, helped to put these maps together. And what they show is the racial demographics of the city. And on the map on the left-hand side, the darker red areas represent the African American population, and in the right-hand side map, the darker red areas represent the white population. And what you can immediately see, if you can recognize the kind of places there, but we can see the city around you, is how the highway system in the city acts very much as a demarcation of different racial demographics in the city. That is, south of 630 and east of I-30 is where the vast majority of the non-white population is concentrated, and west of 40 and north of 630 is where the vast majority of the white population is situated. So it's a racially divided city by geography. That where you live determines, and which part of the city you live in has a large part to play in kind of profiling which racial group or ethnic group you belong to. And the city schools reflect that, and I'll come back to these later on, but I just wanted to get the sense of what the city looks like today and the idea that it is a racially divided city geographically. And what I want to say is that it didn't always look like that. It will look very different at the beginning of the 20th century. and that Little Rock has become the city it is today over the course of the 20th century, and has moved from being a relatively geographically integrated city to a relatively geographically segregated city. And what I want to explain in the talk today is how that happened, what the consequences of that are today, and how we got to a city that looks like it does in the present. So, and let me say that, if you look back here, this square, the blue square that just popped up there, is the area that I'm going to start by looking at. And that's really the downtown core of Little Rock, as it was at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the things that we see throughout the course of the 20th century is the massive sprawl of the city. The city has massively expanded in the last 50 years or so. But this blue square is the place I'm going to start, which is the core of Little Rock in the early part of the 20th century. So here it is, and here's a map of Little Rock in 1900, which is, a very small downtown core. Little Rock expands all the time, but that's basically what Little Rock looks like in 1900. And mapped onto that, there is the African American population and the demographics of what that city looks like. And what you immediately see is a striking difference between this map and the map of today. And as if we transpose the map of today in terms of geographical segregation onto here, what you would expect is, a red top and a white bottom, a kind of, hard divide. What we see here is a mixed pattern of residents, right, with African Americans and whites living in all different corners of the city. There are clearly discernible white areas and clearly discernible African American areas, but they're not shoved onto one part and shoved onto the other. They are what was colloquially known as salt and pepper neighborhoods, that is black and white sprinkled together. So here you have a city that is geographically relatively well integrated. And there's a correlation, I'd say, between this and Jim Crow segregation. That is, Jim Crow segregation, these laws that were passed to kind of provide for the segregation of races in public places in the 1890s, in some ways are related to this pattern of housing. Because in the late 1800s, after the end of Reconstruction, many places across the South experienced a kind of little bit of urbanization. It's difficult to over-exaggerate, but towns and cities begin to grow after the end of Reconstruction. And that goes hand in hand with the emergence of a Jim Crow system of segregation. Disfranchisement, Jim Crow laws, rising racial violence all tend to kind of emerge in the 1890s. And those things play an important role and are related to the way that the city is growing at the time. Because one of the issues here in this city is that it looks very much like an integrated city. And whites in 1900 don't really want an integrated city. But in some ways, it's such a small downtown corridor, and the needs of the day-to-day interactions mean that whites and African Americans live in places that are close to one another, that are not far apart. And in some ways, the Jim Crow system is an answer to that, because the problem is this looks like an integrated city. But Jim Crow allows for an integrated, geographically integrated city like this to exist, because it maps a fairly arbitrary framework of racial separation on top of it. So if you have black and white schools enforced by law, if you have black and white water fountains, if you have black and white sections on streetcars, you maintain a racial hierarchy and racial distinction and racial division in ways that might otherwise be blurred. So in some ways, Jim Crow and Jim Crow laws and disfranchisement and rising racial violence are ways of exercising racial control that allow an integrated city like this, because whites can still exert and impose a racial hierarchy in the city through Jim Crow, through disfranchisement, because African Americans can't vote, so therefore they can't determine who the elected officials are who run the city. So there's a kind of different form of racial hierarchy that's imposed in the city that allows this to exist as a racially, geographically integrated city. What I'm going to suggest is that throughout the course of the 20th century, what happens, particularly from the mid part of the 20th century, is that as these forms of racial hierarchy that keep things in place, like Jim Crow, like disfranchisement, like racial violence, decline and are dismantled, what happens instead is that a different form of segregation emerges, which is based on geographical separation. So here you have geographical integration with all those other things. What you have throughout the course of the 20th century is a flip of that those other things, as they demise, a new form of segregation based on geography emerges to take its place. So it looks fairly integrated because you have these other things, I would argue. And this characterizes the city for much of the first part of the 20th century. As you can see here, 1930 City of Little Rock Comprehensive City Plan. It says, the present distribution of the coloured population in the city reflects the same principles that apply in the general growth of the city. The coloured businesses and residence areas are, in general, well distributed from a geographical viewpoint. And as in the 1930s, looking at the city, you can see that there's a mixture of African American white businesses and residences that are relatively close to one another. In 1941, on the eve of the Second World War, the Urban League conducts a survey of Negroes. And again, this confirms by report the kind of visualization of the city that I looked at in 1900. Again, it says, while Negroes predominate in certain sections, notably West 9th Street, the business district in Little Rock, which is the heart of downtown Black Little Rock, there are, rather curiously, no widespread black belts. Even in the so-called Negro sections, white persons conduct restaurants, grocery and clothing stores, and in some instances live in adjoining dwellings. So even here up to 1941, you see this continuation of a relatively small, core, reasonably integrated city in which African Americans and whites interact close by one another on a fairly regular, intimate basis. And again, I'd argue that Jim Crow and all those other things have to keep that in place. They form this framework and apparatus of racial segregation that allows this interracial mixing to go on. So, what happens and what changes? I'd argue that in the mid-20th century, and this, I have several students who are doing research on this and kind of looking into this, and they would say that this goes back to the 1930s. One of the things that I'd say is a key defining break in the city's development is urban renewal, and particularly the Housing Act of 1949. The Housing Act of 1949, as it's passed, is a post-war act to try and redesign America's cities for the 20th century. And of course, the United States has increasingly the wealth to redesign its cities and to modernize its cities and to beautify its cities. And so for a rebuilding of American cities is envisioned, and the Housing Act of 1949 provides funds for urban renewal. Part of the story is slum clearance, as it's called. So part of this story is called slum clearance, in which old housing stock is demolished with federal dollars and new housing stock is built. So let me take you through this process. And this is all funded by the federal government to the tune of millions of dollars. And Little Rock becomes one of the key cities in the nation for its eagerness and success in getting these funds to redevelop the city. So one of the things that we see here on this map, and this is from the Center for Arkansas History and Culture Archives, urban renewal is good for you, it tells you. And this is 1959 urban renewal slum clearance areas identified by the Little Rock Housing Authority. And one of the things you can see from the map is the correlation between what the city regards as slum areas and African American areas of residence. These dark red areas are areas of predominantly African American residents. And you can see that those blue lines, which are the slum clearance areas for demolition, very closely correlate with African American concentrations of residents. And euphemistically, slum clearance becomes known throughout the South as Negro removal. So it becomes known as Negro removal. And one of the things I will say is that this story of Little Rock helps also to illuminate what's going on in other southern cities at the time and other places nationwide. This is not just a specific Little Rock story. This story is unfolding in many cities across the South and across the United States. But something very particular and very specific is going on in southern cities. So slum clearance areas are designated as those areas which are largely of African American population. And, some of these houses probably are dilapidated and, are not up to code, if you like. But one of the issues in the African American community, because of segregation, because African Americans tend to live, even though they're mixed in with white areas, have kind of African American neighborhoods within that, African American blocks, that the black middle class tends to live in the black community alongside the black working class. So one of the issues with these areas is that sometimes they're quite nice houses, quite opulent homes, next to what might be regarded as slum homes. And one of the issues about slum clearance is that the charge is that a lot of neighborhoods are indiscriminately raised, even though they might have mixed housing in them. These neighborhoods are just kind of erased from the map and destroyed. And of course, when you've got federal dollars behind you, when you have eminent domain behind you, it's difficult to stop these things from happening. And there are a number of lawsuits, but ultimately, slum clearance goes ahead, and a lot of the African American parts of town, a lot of African American neighborhoods are demolished. And you can still see today some of the gaps in African American neighborhoods. If you look at the Dunbar Community Center, for example, where Flanders Smith is now redeveloping those areas with the buildings, that used to be a big blank empty gap in the middle of a black neighborhood. And a lot of these gaps are caused by slum clearance and urban renewal programs that go back to this period. So the first part of this is removing African American housing from downtown, removing African American neighborhoods, and essentially erasing downtown African American neighborhoods from the map. This is the other part of the sheet. Urban renewal is good for you, on the back, so shut up. This is progress, this is the way forward, this is what we're going to do. So this is kind of at the heart of the story. And there's a lot going on here, so let me talk you through this. Slum clearance and public housing. So first of all, we look at slum clearance, and those people have been removed from downtown. Those houses, private housing and stock African Americans, have been removed. So then the question is, where do those people go? What happens to those people? So at the same time, what is happening in the city is that new public housing is being built with this funding. And you can see these homes here, Holmesworth Grove, 1955, 200 apartments for African Americans, Ives Homes, 1950, And what you can see in the city is that public housing units, public housing stock is being built, and it's still acceptable to build them segregated at this time. So not till the 1960s that Kennedy outlaws this kind of segregation. And so African American public housing is being built increasingly towards the east of the city to encourage eastward African American movement. White public housing is increasingly being built towards the west of the city to encourage white movement towards the west. So you destroy these downtown neighborhoods, and then you start to funnel the population to different parts of the city. So you have these public housing projects that you move the downtown population to. Whites are encouraged to go out west, African Americans are moving east. And there are all kinds of strategies that are used to promote the movement of whites towards the west, African Americans towards the east. Some of those are listed at the top. I'll just go briefly through them. Blockbusting, for example. Blockbusting is a practice by which estate agents moved an African American family into a white block of residence to try and encourage those white residents to sell up downtown. So in order to clear the downtown areas, you move an African American family into a white, notionally white block previously. A lot of those white people then sell up and move out west. So for real estate, in real estate terms, this is a goldmine for the real estate people, right? Because what you can do when you're developing new homes is that you can get whites to move, and you can build new housing further and further west and keep moving whites further and further west and having new and new frontiers to build more and more houses. And at the same time, because a lot of the private housing stock downtown has been raised through slum clearance, What you can do is charge inflated rents or inflated prices because there's a shortage of African American housing stock. And so you can, those houses that you've got for cheap, selling off from whites who want to get out of increasingly African American areas, you can then sell at inflated prices to African Americans, so the shortage of private housing. So you make a profit on both ends. You can sell high to African Americans, you can buy cheap from whites, and you can sell high to whites out west. So you can keep this real estate market going. Redlining is a common practice that was used in the 20th century, and as the name suggests, it almost literally means drawing a red line on the map and saying, we don't give loans to African Americans in these areas. In some places like Chicago, they would actually draw a red line on the map, get a map out, draw a red line and say, this is for white areas of residence. We don't loan money for homes to African Americans here. So African Americans are effectively excluded from buying in those places because they can't get a mortgage. Most of the federal mortgages that are issued are also issued mostly to whites. 98% of federal housing administration mortgages go to whites rather than to African Americans. So in the private market, African Americans are frozen out through both public and private practices too. Finally, there's the idea of racial steering too. That's a practice used by real estate agents. When people come to the city, real estate agents will take African Americans and African American families over to the east, and they'll say this is where African Americans live, and we'll only show African Americans homes in the eastern part of the city. When white families and white people come to the city, we'll take them to the west, and they'll say this is where white people live, and we'll only show homes to whites in the western part of the city. So all these practices, among others, kind of collude, both in terms of private practices and public policy, to create a city that is increasingly encourages whites to move west, African Americans to move east. An important part of that story that shows the overlap of the kind of decay of one segregated regime and the rise of another is school desegregation. Right? So in 1954, school desegregation maps onto this, as this is all happening. And up until the mid-1950s, until school desegregation came to Little Rock, you had two main high schools in the city. You had Central High School, which is the white high school. You had Dunbar High School, which was the African-American high school, both built in the late 1920s. Dunbar, supposedly a kind of third-scale model of Central High. And they still exist today. You still probably have seen them and know where they are, since you live in the city. And they're not that far away from one another, right? They're relatively close. They're only several blocks away. But again, since they're segregated schools, you don't need to build them that far away from one another because it's accepted that blacks go here, whites go here, and there's no kind of catchment areas or anything like that to worry about of overlapping. That's the law. That's the way it is. But what happens once you destroy that law? What happens once you say no segregation anymore? You have to desegregate schools. Virgil Blossom takes charge of the school desegregation plan in Little Rock in the mid-1950s. And key towards school desegregation in Little Rock is building new schools. Blossom says, okay, we'll desegregate in 1957. And, the brand new Board of Education comes down in 1954. Why does Little Rock wait until September 1957 to desegregate? Well, because it's building new schools. So it's creating a new school system to respond to what's happening in housing. And the two new schools that Blossom builds are Horace Mann High School, again, which is still here today, which is built over to the east part of the city. I think I've got a map, so yeah, I'll come back. So here are the schools today. So Blossom builds Horace Mann High School in the eastern part of the city, and he builds its pair, Hall High School, in the extreme white part of the city, extreme western white part of the city. Hall High is built about as far west as you can possibly get in Little Rock at the time. And one of the things that we know about Little Rock now, in terms of its sprawl, is in the mid-1950s, where Hall High School is the absolute edge of the city. North, university is kind of the western edge of town, and after that you're into the wilderness. Today, it's called Midtown. So Little Rock is, Midtown has gone from being like the extreme west of town to being Midtown, middle of the city, which tells you, just how far the city has sprawled since the mid-1950s. And with schools, you get the beginning of a school system that expands and that builds hand in hand with the placement of housing in the city, and which both reflects and reinforces the segregation that exists in the city. So if you build Hull High and White High School in an affluent white area, it encourages whites to move over towards the White High School. If you build Horace Mann High School over in the east part of the city, it encourages African Americans to stay close to Horace Mann and the African American High School. It certainly doesn't encourage African Americans to try and get to Hull High School, which is right on the other side of the city. And the Little Rock School District grows hand in hand with this. So if you look at the schools today as they exist, what you see is schools that map onto the racial divisions that exist in the city. So what you have in the city essentially is south of 630 and west and east of 40 is where most of the public schools are located. And most of the public schools are predominantly African American. Many of what social scientists would call hyper-segregated schools. Whereas towards the west of I-40 and the north of 630, what you have are mainly white private schools, but what Christian, Pulaski, Baptist, Catholic, St. Mary, Episcopal. So you can map the schools and the growth of the city's housing patterns hand in hand in the way that both segregated housing and segregated schools follow one another. They both reinforce and reflect one another. So we end up with a city that moves from being a relatively geographically integrated city in the 1900, and that has this arbitrary framework of segregation, disfranchisement, racial violence to kind of keep the racial hierarchy in check. But what happens over the course of the first part of the 20th century and accelerates at mid-century is that all those things decline. That segregation is being unpicked after the Second World War bit by bit. That disfranchisement is lowering bit by bit. And that racial violence is also declining. Lynchings decline in that period. So in some ways you might say, well, that represents the positive trend, and if you want to uptick the positive, you can see all those things are in decline. Those are the things that constitute racial discrimination. Those are bad things, we're getting rid of them, we're progressing beyond that. What I'm suggesting is that as one more archaic and increasingly ineffectual regime of segregation disappears, another one is already in place to take over from it. That is, because those very things that allow geographical integration in the city are beginning to disappear, whites are looking for a way to maintain racial hierarchy and racial control in the city without the kind of things that they've been used to leaning on in the past. And geographical segregation offers a way to do that. Because if you build a geographically segregated city that puts the white population on one side and the black population on the other side, then all those facilities follow one another, right? So white private schools follow white neighborhoods. Black public schools stay in those black neighborhoods. If you build facilities like parks, any other kind of infrastructure, shops, all those kinds of things, they follow those patterns. So in effect, if you have a geographically segregated city, by definition, all of those kinds of things that Jim Crow relied on to segregate will still be segregated by definition of geographical separation. That is, you had at one point these water fountains that said white and coloured, and they were side-by-side differentiation, but you lose those, but you kind of move those water fountains further and further apart so that they're now on one side of the city and the other side of the city. So you don't need those signs on them anymore. They're de facto black and white. So what I'm arguing is that what happens in the course of the 20th century in Little Rock is that one system and regime of segregation replaces another. The Jim Crow system and the things that are affiliated with it slowly decline, and we look at those and think those are the kind of quintessential markers of racial discrimination. But what's actually happening, and this is more of the silent story that's not told, although increasingly it is now, is that there's another form of segregation emerging, which achieves the same things, but in a different kind of way that looks different. So in some ways, we're fooled into thinking that things have changed because they look different. But I think what you have to look at is what the actual outcomes are. Even though segregation looks different in the city today than it did under Jim Crow, the same kinds of fundamental effects are still achieved. That is, it's a segregated city with segregated schools and segregated facilities, and is increasingly being polarized in that way. So that's a very different kind of way of thinking about and looking at the civil rights movement and changes in patterns of race relations in Little Rock and in the South and the United States during the 20th century. One that's not moving from a decline of segregation to a rise of civil rights and freedom, but one in which one more archaic and ineffectual regime of segregation, Jim Crow, is increasingly being replaced by a far more effective, a far more entrenched, and a far more difficult to erase form of segregation that is put in its place. So what you see is a kind of rise and triumph and increasing sophistication of a segregated city rather than its demise, which is the kind of other narrative you might look at. And that kind of encapsulates my argument and what I have to say about that today. So, what I'm always interested in at these talks, when I cast this kind of 30,000-foot vision of what's happened over the course of the 20th century, is how people insert themselves into this history. And I've given this talk in many different places, in many different kind of areas and neighborhoods, in front of many different kind of demographic audiences. It's always fascinating to hear how they fit themselves into this story. One of the most fascinating things I've found as I've spoken is the Q&A sessions and how people kind of respond to this. The very similar questions you get often from groups, and then those big kind of different perspectives that people have on the city. So anyway, I've said my bit, and so I'm going to turn it over to you now for your feedback and ask for questions and thoughts and observations from you. So thank you. And over to you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Kirk, looking out in what is now West Little Rock, you got 3 private high schools. I know Arkansas Baptist and Prep was started in 1980, right around the Joshua era. Have you looked at a chance at that era of public school deseg and the effect on housing in that area, and start with any kind of education and any type of educational change?
I haven't, but I got a student who's done some great work on the rise of private schools in Little Rock, Jeffrey Stewart, who just published a piece in the last Arkansas Historical Quarterly. He's published a couple of pieces in the Pulaski County Historical Review. And what he found is that private schools really take off in the early 1970s as a response to busing. The private schools are really kind of, the proliferation of private schools that you see in Little Rock really start in the early 1970s in response to busing. But busing is an interesting thing here, right? Because, in some ways, my story and this map helps to explain why busing comes in the early 1970s. Because if you put the whole of white population on one side of the city and the whole of black population on the other side of the city, and you put white schools out here and you put black schools over this side of the city, really the only way to desegregate them is to start taking black students from this side of the city and putting them in white schools on that side of the city, and taking white kids from that part of the city and putting them into the black part of the city, right? And that's the only way to do it, because you've already shunted those populations off to different places. So the only way you can have integrated schools is through busing. And of course, people then respond by building private schools and talking about forced busing, and we don't want busing in our neighborhoods, etc., etc. But in some ways, busing really, in the early 1970s is the only remedy for cities that look like this. And nobody really talks about the kind of, at that point, the origins of the necessity for busing at that time, because, if you create a city like that, you can't desegregate along catchment lines anymore. You have to kind of intervene in the same way that real estate has intervened and the federal government has intervened to create a city like that. Then you have to have the same kind of intervention to reverse that trend. And busing seems like a very blunt tool. In some ways, busing is a blunt tool to try and combat another blunt tool, which was used to create that situation in the first place. So, busing and those kinds of things drive the rise of private schools. And of course, another part of that is the kind of public-private sector thing. One of the things that you see with the emergence of the geographical segregation as well, one of the other themes that runs through is the decline and shrinking of the public sector and public areas. You know, one of the other things I've written about, for example, is swimming pools. Little Rock Swimming Pool at War Memorial Park was desegregated in 1965. And, you know, there are no big public swimming pools in Little Rock anymore. Like War Memorial used to be, where there used to be thousands of people swimming there, you know, on an evening. And so, you know, one of the things that this has done is kind of shifted discrimination increasingly from the public realm to the private realm. And of course, if you put it in the private realm, then it's much more difficult to get hold of. And in a sense, housing segregation, you know, takes it out of the hands of public schools and, you know, public places and says this is a private matter now. People are free to buy wherever they want and whatever they want, etc. So in some ways, what you see as a part of this process is the decline in public services, decline in public areas, and increasing emphasis on the private realm. Because the private realm is increasingly, as the courts move, beyond the remit of the courts and beyond the reach of the courts. So there's a lot going on. I think this, you know, impacts so many different kinds of ways. Yeah.
So in relation to schools, both public and private, including the growth of charter schools, I'd like if you could comment on our current situation, about within 5 years running out of the loss of local control of the Little Rock School District. And of course, this ideology of privatization, which is, I think, been pushed by some of the Walton Foundation, among others, to solution to improving education. Anyway, so in light of the history of this demographic separation of segregation, could you comment on the current problem, serious situation about the current Little Rock School District?
Of course, there are a lot of moving parts and aspects to that. But I think one of the things that you can see as an extension of this in the schools today is this clamour for neighbourhood schools, right? The clamour to build a white high school, effectively what it would be out west, versus a southwest high school, which would be Latino and African American. I mean, you can still see in the arguments that take place in the city the relationship between schools and residents and race and ethnicity and how they map onto the city. I think this helps to explain how that works. But, you know, the clamour today is, you know, is for neighbourhood schools, right? We want neighbourhood schools. We've got the right to have schools in our own neighbourhoods. That's all we want. We just want, you know, but, you know, if you build segregated neighbourhoods and you build neighbourhood schools, then you have segregated schools, right? It's a continuum. And if you divorce the kind of contemporary clamour for neighbourhood schools from what happens before it to create those segregated neighbourhoods, it looks very, you know, neutral, right? All we want is schools where we live, around our own neighbourhoods. What's wrong with that? Well, you know, these neighbourhoods have been created by federal and public money and public policy in ways which were previously illegal to create those neighbourhoods in which you now want to build those neighbourhood schools. So, you know, this institutionalization of segregation is much more difficult to address than Jim Crow. You know, I mean, to end Jim Crow segregation, all you needed to do was take down that white sign on the water fountain. To end entrenched geographical segregation that's developed over decades is a whole different prospect together, right? I mean, it's once you ingrain it into the city, once you literally inscribe and build it into the city, then it's much more difficult to get rid of. You know, you can't wash that out in the same way that you could wash Jim Crow, you know. And integrating a lunch counter is relatively simple, despite, you know, all the difficulties that were encountered and the violence that was encountered and et cetera and all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, it's quite simple. You just let an African American sit at that lunch counter. Desegregating an entire city is a prospect of an entirely different order altogether, I think. So.
Are there any areas that are all running kind of counter to your narrative? And I'm wondering about downtown as a possibility.
Right. And where we are today, right? These areas. Yeah, I mean, you know, you get into another story then, right, of gentrification. And that's the issue, right? Because, and this is what makes it difficult, right? I think it's, thinking about housing and how housing works as a form of segregation is quite different to the way we normally think about segregation. I think the remedies are quite different too, as I was, just intimating then. It looks different, and, it's not, a white person and an African-American person sitting at a lunch counter. A white person moving into a neighborhood, an African-American neighborhood, one white person won't change the complexion of the neighborhood significantly, it didn't bring resources with it. But also, too many white people moving into an African-American neighborhood risk gentrifying that area and displacing that African-American population all over again and continuing this cycle. So it's, it's very difficult because then you get into gentrification and displacement and, this happens. And, I think part of that relates to also to this, to what's actually going on here and what's at stake. Because I think ultimately underneath all this is resources, right? I mean, in some ways it's not that the white population's over this side of the city and the black population's over this side of the city. I don't think that's very desirable in its own right. But the crucial thing is that where the black population lives has far fewer resources. It's far less well-funded, has fewer groceries, has more food deserts, has all those things that come with it. So it's not just the physical, racial and ethnic separation, it's also what comes with that that's crucial. The lack of resources and the kind of proliferation of resources in white parts of town and the under-resourced parts of the African-American parts of town. And if you bring those resources, like this place in, it's great, but it becomes an oasis in a large island, and, it may also ultimately, if this area is developed, then what happens to the historic African-American neighborhoods that are here? In some ways it repeats the slum clearance all over again, and those people get moved out and maybe even further outside of the city and further away from facilities that exist, because, a lot of this is related to economics as well, and who can afford to buy where. And in some ways that, again, places us away from the public realm into the private realm. But, another key thing about housing is that, housing has been the main vehicle for wealth for many people since the Second World War. And, a lot of white family wealth has been built on home ownership because prices have continued to rise. But African Americans were denied through law federal loans to buy houses in those areas. So, housing is fundamental to the massive wealth gap that exists between African American families and white families. That's one of the biggest gaps that exists in the United States today, is the wealth gap between African American families and white families. White families, in part because of booming housing markets, have had the chance to build wealth that African Americans haven't, which again perpetuates this, right? Because if you don't have money to buy in these areas, you can't buy in those areas. And even though redlining might not exist anymore, maybe or maybe not, it depends who you ask, even if it was a free market now, the accumulated wealth doesn't exist for African Americans, many African Americans, to be able to buy in those areas because they're priced out of those areas. So even though, it's kind of, you replace one thing by another, these kind of regimes decline, but they're replaced by other things that become self-perpetuating. So.
Can you talk a little bit about the demographics of Little Rock versus the state as a whole in terms of percentages? A little bit. We look at this map and it looks like the red and the white sort of all set, but the populations are quite different, I think, percentage-wise. But I assume Little Rock is more, it's got more African Americans than the state as a percentage.
Right, it does now. The demographic change is another kind of layer of this story, right? But, in 1957, when Central High desegregates, Little Rock is 75% white, 25% African American, which mirrors the rest of the state. Or, well, actually, it's even smaller by population, but, it kind of mirrors the state at the time. More closely now, for the first time in 2010, Little Rock became officially a non-white city, majority non-white city for the first time. So the African American population has almost doubled since 1957. So, Little Rock, as you know, if you can tell if you travel anywhere around the state, Little Rock is essentially the only truly urban area in the state. So it's kind of different in some ways. It has its own microcosm to other places. But of course, the state has, in terms of racial demographics, has often been divided too. The African American population is heavily populating those delta counties that border Mississippi, and the northwest of Arkansas has been overwhelmingly white, with many white-only counties. Although, again, there's another story to that. You know, if you look at Guy Lancaster's work on racial cleansing, there's kind of, you know, been premeditated efforts to keep that part of the state white. But of course, that is changing now with the chicken industry and the influx of Latino population, which, you know, several years ago was one of the fastest growing Latino populations in the United States. So the demographics kind of change all the time, but, you know, Little Rock has grown since then, but the racial composition has changed significantly since then as well. So yeah, I mean, that's another kind of layer to this, but, you know, I think the housing stuff is kind of fascinating because it's a thread that once you start to pull on, you know, all these other things start to shake out and you realize how they're all interconnected with one another, I think.
All right, so what brought about gentrification? What brought about the change? And you talked about where we are right now, which at one time was considered the desolate, you know, no man's land, flooding. City services were ignored. Now, I can't begin to tell you the trillions of dollars that went out on the both Marina and now we have walking trails and bike trails and turnabouts, whatever, roundabouts and all this glamour with green grass. But at one time, this city ignored city services to this part of town. So what brought about the change? Why is gentrification now a big deal? So how did white flight reverse to coming back?
Right, I think there are lots of different aspects to that. Let me try and go through them. So one, I think, you know, people would root that with Bill Clinton. And credited to Bill Clinton and the building of the presidential library.
Right, that was the beginning.
Right, on its knees, and there were no new companies coming into Little Rock because of what had happened here. You know, there was economic depression, and the only thing that was booming was the housing industry. And the only way to keep the housing industry going was to keep building more and more new homes. And if you keep moving people further and further west, and give them a reason to move further and further west, then you've got a reason to build more and more homes. But, you know, at some point you're going to reach, you do one of two things. You either reach the end of the county and you build places like Cabot and you build places like Benton, which is part of this story. You know, people leave the county altogether. Or you find cheaper parts of the county, you know, places to buy and build and sell them all over again. You know, you bring everybody back to the city, build them up, build those houses, and then, you know, scare everybody out of the city again, and then get moving back into those houses and redevelop. You know, you've got to keep people moving. If you want to make a profit in the real estate industry, you have to keep turnover going. You can't have it, you know, stand still. So I think part of gentrification.
I know we're talking about Little Rock. So, but why is there a problem such as in Harlem, where whites are coming back into and buying up property in Harlem? I mean, what is the reverse of it? Be it Harlem, be it Little Rock, be it anywhere. What is the phenomenon that has reversed it? I mean, even in my neighborhood.
I think it's the way that cities act as hubs and rising costs of gas prices, I guess. People don't want to commute as much.
Gas is cheap in America.
Well, still relatively to the rest of the world, but relatively to the United States.
Compared to the rest
People
of the
don't want
world,
to make those long commutes anymore. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that drive those demographics.
Okay, so that's the silent, untold story that we don't know what reversed this trend of coming back into the city or buying up. I mean, just go to 15th and Battery, a desolate house. Just go to that neighborhood. I mean, the neighborhood was becoming somewhat depressed. Now it's vibrant, right? Because Children's Hospital employees are buying the houses.
Keep it going, keep it rolling. Yes, sir. Right.
To kind of follow up on that, we've got vast areas of this city where there's nothing. Bulldozers came and then nothing ever came afterward. And we built west, and we built a big freeway to get people back and forth. And we put all these incentives in place to make the population less and less dense. Why is it that it's incentivized to build way out west and not to build in all these places where we've already got streets
I mean, it's, you know, and to follow on from that, it is kind of a bit rich, right? If you move out in the middle of nowhere and then start complaining because there are no schools here. Well, there are lots of schools if you want to live close to school, but, you know, it's kind of a tail wagging the dog thing, right, when you get to that point. Yes, ma'am.
What is a conscientious Caucasian to do? How do you suggest we vote? How do we proceed? Now, I'm from Pulaski County. I now live in Faulkner County. But I feel what you're saying. You know, what can we do?
Right.
What do we do? Do we shop local? Continue to shop local? How can we make this better?
Big question, of course. But, you know, I mean, there are different aspects to that question, you know, I mean, or different answers to it. You know, at a very basic level, you know, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 is often called the Fair Housing Act, which contained provisions to try and end racially discriminatory practices in the housing market. Just before he left office, Barack Obama sent a memo to Housing and Urban Development reminding them that they needed to follow the law. So basic civil rights laws are not rigorously enforced, and when Donald Trump came in, he said, delay that order. And of course, Ben Carson then was put in charge of HUD, you know. So I mean, there's those basic things. People will say, you know, we'll talk about Section 8 housing and when you build it, and zoning and ordinances and variances and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, and ultimately it kind of comes down to, you know, hundreds of millions, if not trillions of dollars over decades have been pumped into creating a segregated city. And when you're trying to fight against that tide, what you, I guess, need to do is to want that, you know, want that kind of solution. And then, you know, there's the question of whether desegregation is the solution to this. I mean, is it about desegregation? Is it about resources? Do you, or should you try and put an effort into desegregating the city, or should you try and mobilize a larger, newfound African-American voice and political power into putting more money into African-American neighborhoods, redeveloping those neighborhoods?
Support minority businesses, yes.
So I think there are lots of different aspects to how you might approach this, which, you know, could go on forever.
I think we'll let Mr. Campbell give us our closer question.
Arkansas business this week, 30 years in Chanel. I was out there today for a meeting. If you know what Coles is, and you know where Loyola is, I can cut from the Arkansas River straight down to Saline County. There's no reason for any of that population to come downtown and list their jobs down in the bank, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or whatever. There's your segregation right there. You said you build it out, you can't go. And one other thing, I moved here in 1967 and ran 2 children through the school. Horace Mann, Booker, all of them, busting back and forth that you talk about. We're not any closer to where we were when I moved here in 1967. We're worse off right now. You still have a public school system, you don't have anything. So these are things for you all to think about. I'm going this way, and some of you are coming this way. Those are things. And I spent 25 years in the real estate business, so I can tell you about Pulaski Academy, Marlowe Manor, you know, the whole bit. Maybe I'll be right in.
Right, and of course, you know, I've written about this in several different places, but, you know, Pulaski Academy is an interesting story in its own right, who, you know, Pulaski Academy built by William Rector, who's one of the biggest real estate people in the city, and again, you know, the very fact that you have a real estate developer building a all-white school like that, and, you know, when Pulaski Academy is open, Rector says, this is a school for whites who don't want a bus. That's what he says in the press conference. So, you know, I mean, it's not hidden, it's pretty explicit.
I think we need to give Dr. Kirk a big round of applause. So, wait, don't go away yet. I have some for you. I have some stuff for you. So he, we all kind of knew the obvious things, but he's also helping us understand the deeper layers, which is very helpful. So we appreciate that. So we have a little thank you gift, which is this orchid, which you all take home tonight. And we also have him, we're giving him some of our swag so he can promote the QQA. And I think the question that the gentleman in the back asked too, the same thing. Of course, we have low impact fees in Little Rock, right? So you build all that stuff out west, there's no impact. We have no capacity to sustain the areas with, infrastructure and what have you. And yes, we have a ton of infrastructure downtown. So of course, the QQA, we promote development downtown, rehab areas. That's right, Quapaw Towers. It's historic too. So yes, it ties into the mission we have too. But this also helps us understand a little bit better what we're up against, which is quite amazingly challenging. But nonetheless, we appreciate this deeper understanding of our current situation that we've arrived at. Before you all leave tonight, there's still some food and beverage, so grab something on your way out. But I just want to remind you, we are going to have a preservation conversation next month. If you're a member of the QQA, you're going to be getting your preservation conversation brochure in the mail probably within the next week or two. It's at the printer right now. So we have an awesome lineup. If you're one of our friends online, that you can sit down now if you want to. If you follow us online or if you get our emails, you also get notifications about the preservation conversations. The one that's coming up on January the 9th, it's Mr. Tad Bohannon. He's the chief executive officer of the Central Arkansas Water, and he's going to talk about the history of public water in Central Arkansas. And it's really great. They reached out to us about different topics to cover, and I said, could you talk about history of our water, public water? And he said, that's one of my favorite topics. So he's going to come and talk about one of our utilities. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and I have a little image here, is, hold on. I think it shut down on me. It's kind of frozen. There we go. There we go. We are going to be having our members only reception on January the 23rd, and it's going to be at the home of Chief Justice and Mrs. Kemp at their home, the historic Reading House. So if you're not a member of the QQA, you have time to join, and you can also join at the door. If you're a member, we look forward to seeing you. Just let us know you're going to be there. And at that, I think we're done for the night. Thank you all very much for coming.